Hey, everybody. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. You'll notice that we're not on a webinar for this because I'm hoping some of you will want to participate by speaking and not just typing. So that's why we're not in a webinar. And we're going to be using chat on here. Let me get the chat started. We'll get started in 2 minutes. We'll wait for a few more people to show up. All right, a whole bunch of people are getting on now. This is great. All right, we'll get started in 30 seconds. I'll bring up some slides. Like I said, if you just joined us, we're not in a webinar tonight because I'm hoping we can do a little bit more chatting since we're in a smaller group. I'm definitely looking to hear some of your voices and hear your thoughts on what we're discussing tonight. And so we're not going to be doing a Slack chat like we normally would with a bonfire. We'll just be chatting on here. So we'll try something new. If that doesn't work out, if we feel like it's unruly to have everybody talking on here, then maybe we'll go back to a chat for the next one. But for tonight, we'll stick with our voices. So if you want to say something, you can just unmute yourself when I start asking for your thoughts and questions. All right, so let's get started. All right, so like I emailed you tonight, we're going to be talking about free speech and Facebook's new Supreme Court. I'm going to go full screen for a second here. You can forget about this icebreaker question because it's We don't have a chat going. So forget about that. All right, so before we get into talking about Facebook's new Supreme Court and the article that I sent you, I want to do a quick overview of the First Amendment, just so we're all on the same page. Okay, so to refresh a little bit about the First Amendment, here is the full text of it, and I'll explain why it's kind of highlighted strangely here. The full text says, Congress, so right away we know who this is directed at. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. When I was a teacher, I often had my students use the acronym GRAPES to remember these 6 freedoms that are in here. I also highlighted them: grievances, religion, assembly, press, exercise, and speech. Now, when this was passed, the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government at first. And so again, it says Congress shall make no law. Eventually, though, it applied to state governments through what was known as the incorporation doctrine when the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War. It was the due process clause in the 14th Amendment that made the First Amendment and all of the Bill of Rights apply to the states, which made sense, right? If Congress couldn't pass a law restricting free speech, then neither should a state. So that's why that was incorporated. And then, question I have for you here. Oh, we've got some more people in the waiting room. We just let them in. Oh, Gary's joining us. Nice to see you, Gary. You showed up a little late. You missed the intro on the First Amendment. So I'll quickly recap. We're talking about the text of the First Amendment. Now, a question for you all. I'm going to go back so I can see your faces. Is, does the First Amendment apply to non-government entities like private businesses, private colleges, nonprofits like CU? Do you think the First Amendment applies in the same way as it does to the federal government or the state government? And if anybody wants to answer, they can just turn on their mic and answer that.
I would say that it shouldn't apply to private businesses because they have the right to monitor what is said in their platform or business or whatever it is.
Yeah, so you're right. It does. The First Amendment does not apply to private entities, and you often see people dismissed from their jobs, for instance, if, say, they post something that their employer does not support online. They can lose their job over that. And that's because, as we just saw, the text of the First Amendment clearly says it only applies to Congress, right? Congress shall make no law. The founders were worried about the government taking away someone's taking away these rights. Now, a lot of private businesses and nonprofits, et cetera, schools, for instance, they do respect these First Amendment rights. And it's only in kind of extreme cases that we see them say, you know, it actually doesn't apply to us, so we're going to take a different stand. Second question here: are there limits to free speech? Right? Can you just say I have blanket free speech rights wherever I go all the time? Can you just say whatever you want at any time? Are there any limits to free speech? Does anyone think that there are limits to free speech?
Yeah, so usually in like cases where it's like against the public good or like it harms like public benefit, usually then it's like suppressed. Like if you go into like obviously this is old, but or if you go into like a plane and you say that like you have a bomb, you know, that's just like we can restrict that just because that's, you know, bad for everyone, really.
Great example. Yep. There are definitely limits to free speech, and here are some of them. The one You just mentioned in an airport, for instance, you give up a lot of rights in an airport. You give up even more than your free speech rights. You give up your Fourth Amendment right to search and seizure also. But so here are some limits to free speech. In inciting of violence, you can't get up and say to a bunch of people, let's all go and destroy this building. Let's all go and attack this person. That is inciting violence. It is not protected speech. And so you can be punished for that. You can't use fighting words. So you can't antagonize someone so much that a reasonable person couldn't take it anymore, and it would cause them to fight you. You can't libel or slander. You can't print lies about someone that are damaging to their reputation. You also can't verbally speak those words. That's what slander is. When you speak something that's untrue about someone that's damaging to their reputation, you can get sued for that. Copyright infringement. You can't just take someone else's work and claim, oh, it's protected under free speech. False advertising. If you're a company, if you have a product, you can't just say whatever you want about that product. You can't say that, buy these pills and it will cure cancer. That would be false advertising. And again, you could get sued for that. And then finally, perjury. If you are called to testify in a trial, you can't just lie. You can't just make up whatever you want. If you do lie, you can be prosecuted for perjury, which would be a federal crime. So lots and lots of limits to free speech, not a blanket right. Okay. Before we get to the Facebook stuff, which we're going to get to in a minute, I just wanted to highlight some famous First Amendment cases that I think you should know. If you've taken a civics course, government course, law course, you've probably heard of some of these. But I think it's important to go over some of them, and there are way more. There's hundreds of free speech cases that would be interesting to read, but these are the main ones that I think you should know about. First is Schenck, way back 100 years ago. Schenck was protesting World War I, protesting the draft, saying that it wasn't right to draft Americans to go fight in Europe, and the Supreme Court said that couldn't do that because it actually created a big problem for the United States and our military. The people that were protesting in Schenck had claimed that their First Amendment rights were violated. Supreme Court said, nope. There are times where if you're posing a clear and present danger to the security of the United States, we can take away your free speech rights. And that's where the famous example came in, that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That came from the Schenck case. Another case, West Virginia v. Barnett. This is a school case. This is after World War II. A group of students and parents didn't want to stand up and recite the Pledge of Allegiance in school, and the school decided to suspend them for that, and they appealed. Supreme Court says students are right. We can't force people to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. The right to free speech also includes the right not to speak. If you don't want to speak, you don't have to, particularly in a public school. Third, Tinker v. Des Moines. This is a very important case for students. And so I put this in here because if you haven't heard about it, you should. This case says that you have the right to free speech in school. It wasn't actually written down anywhere before 1973 that students had free speech rights in school. This was a case about students protesting the Vietnam War. They wore black armbands to protest the war, and they were suspended for it. Supreme Court says, sorry, school, can't do that. You're violating their free speech rights, with the exception being that if you're causing a material and substantial disruption in school, you can have your free speech rights removed. So for example, if you were in class and you decided just to constantly scream all class and prevent your teacher from teaching, then you could be removed. That wouldn't fall under free speech. Next case, Brandenburg the Ohio, a very controversial case. This was where a KKK leader, a Klansman, was giving a violent speech, and he was arrested for it. And the Supreme Court actually said that speech was protected because it didn't provoke an imminent threat. It wasn't imminently saying that we need to go destroy something or harm someone or kill someone. Controversial case that some people think gave too many protections to people using violent speech, but nonetheless, it's still considered good case law. Next, Morris v. Frederick. This is another school speech case. A kid in Alaska, at a high school in Alaska, took out a banner during a parade that said, and I kid you not, this is what the banner said: "Bong hits for Jesus," with the number 4 on it. And his school suspended him for unfurling this banner, arguing that it was advocating for illegal drug use. You'd think that this would fall under free speech rights, especially since use of marijuana technically is a political issue. There are two sides to that argument. Well, Supreme Court said nope. Since he was advocating for illegal drug use in his school, he could be suspended for that. And finally, Elonis versus the US, a recent Supreme Court case that gets us talking about Facebook again. This case is about threatening speech on Facebook. A man who was divorced from his wife and family posted threats on Facebook that he was going to harm his wife, his family, the FBI, and some others. And he was prosecuted for those threats. Now, he argued to the Supreme Court that he didn't actually mean it, that these were not quote unquote true threats. And the Supreme Court decided that they were not true threats. You had to prove that the person truly intended to commit that act in order to be prosecuted for it. And they thought that that wasn't the case there. And so he was allowed to post those threats on Facebook. His lawyer compared them to lyrics in an Eminem song. And the fact that those lyrics were not meant to be taken seriously. So if you're interested in reading any more about these cases or Supreme Court cases in general, highly recommend the website Oye, or you can actually just go to Wikipedia. They have pretty good case summaries as well. Okay, I'll stop there for a second. Are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions about these cases, comments? Love to hear some of your thoughts.
I have one question for the last case.
Yeah.
Does that mean on a social media platform, there's no restriction on freedom of speech, like for threats and stuff, if that makes sense?
Sorry, could you say the question one more time?
Yeah, because the Supreme Court said that his threats weren't taken necessarily seriously, or it wasn't an actual threat. What's the limits onto this is an actual threat for on social media? Like, when can it be taken seriously?
Good question. Yeah, really good question. So in order for you to be punished by the government for those threats, in order to be put in jail for it, the government has to prove that you truly believed that you wanted to commit those acts, that you truly believed those threats. And that's for the government to punish you. But we're going to find out for Facebook or for Instagram or for Twitter to remove the speech, they don't have to prove that, right? Because they're private entities, and they can remove that speech by whatever standard they want. And so it's a much higher standard for the government to punish someone for those for that speech. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Great. I see a hand up. I can't see the names on here while I'm sharing the screen. So if you have your hand up, you can feel free to just talk.
I had a quick question about a case that wasn't listed on here.
Yeah.
So there was a recent case with politicians blocking people on Twitter because they were saying they were hate, they were using derogatory terms towards them. And there was a case about whether politicians were allowed to do that or not. Is that protected by the First Amendment or not?
No, that's really interesting. I'm not familiar with that case in particular. My sense is that, again, if it's on a social media platform, you could kind of do whatever you want. It would be different if, let's say, the constituent was in a town hall meeting with the politician. In that sense, the politician would be abridging the constituents' free speech rights if they weren't allowing them to have their voice heard there, as long as they weren't harassing or threatening. If they were harassing or threatening them, then that would cross the line into unprotected speech. And then the politician could probably ask for security to remove them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions about these cases?
Here, Nick, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I don't have a question about the case, but I was curious more on like incitement of violence. So I know there was this huge thing this year about, the riots that occurred and the insurrection that occurred in the Capitol. So I was curious to know how that fits into like, the orders. People say that, oh, you got that, some politicians were inciting that insurrection, how, that fits into whether that's protected under free speech or not.
Yeah, great question. Yeah. So they're gonna have to parse the words very carefully of what was said before the Capitol riots. And so if a court deemed that the language that the president used was similar to language that had been used in the past to incite riots, then could be trouble there. If the court looks at it and says, no, this is more like Brandenburg, which was more about like kind of general threats and not direct threats in the moment, then it'd be considered protected speech. So it would all come down to how it's viewed by the court. But fascinating case, obviously, to test kind of the limits of free speech. And also, there's honestly never been a case that's been tested like this against a public figure as high up as the president, right? Most of the time, these free speech cases are from private citizens that are coming forward. So, big test if that were to ever make it to the Supreme Court.
I also had a question about a case that was not on the list.
Yeah.
I forgot the name, but it was about a student reciting a prayer before a sports game. So would that count as free speech or influence of religion? I just had that thought.
Yeah, no, that's a great thought. So yeah, let's go back to the First Amendment for a second. So the First Amendment is, there's a tension here, right? So it's saying Congress can't establish a religion, right? Congress can't say that Christianity is the official religion of the US. It can't say that Hinduism is the official religion of the US. Can't do that. It says right here, cannot establish religion. But also, you can't prohibit the free exercise thereof. So Congress also, I mean, that's why the first people who came to the United States came here was to practice their religion that they couldn't practice in England. And so founders were very protective of the right to exercise religion. The question in your case about school prayer, there's actually there's 3 big Supreme Court cases about school prayer. One concerned a school having a rabbi come and give a blessing before a graduation. And the Supreme Court there said that they couldn't do that because that seemed like they were establishing a dominant religion at the graduation. And then another case, which might be the one that you're referring to, was about having a cheerleader before a football game recite a prayer. And in that case, it was deemed okay. It wasn't something that was officially sanctioned by the school. It was seen as more of her own personal beliefs, and it was allowed. But the court's jurisprudence on this contention between the establishment of religion and the free exercise thereof is not always clear. And I think this is a case, especially with school prayer, that they've had a tough time finding that middle road. So it seems like the real test is whether the school officially sanctioned it. So if they bring someone in to do a prayer at a graduation, can't do it. If a student on their own wants to give a prayer, though, that is okay. Because if they stop that, then they'd be prohibiting the free exercise of religion.
I had a question connecting to that. So that would be fine at like a private school, right? So because there's like religious private schools, is that because it's not funded by the state?
Correct. So not funded by the state, although that's a tricky territory too, because a lot of private schools do get some public funding. And so I think the key there, though, is that a private school, no one is compelled to go there. That's something that you do of your own volition, whereas a public school is compulsory in most states up to age 16. And so I think that's one of the reasons the court looks at it very differently, and why a prayer would be totally okay at a private school. Good question. Other questions about these cases or about First Amendment in general before we move on to the Facebook stuff?
I have a really quick question.
Yeah. I can't hear you. You can go ahead.
Oh wait, did it unmute?
There you go.
Oh wait, okay, perfect. I want to tie back to what Eduardo said about the insurrections in January. Would it be permissible for certain politicians to almost, I mean, what I'm kind of trying to reference to is when Twitter inherently blocked like most of those like kind of inciting violence Republicans off of the platform. Is that like considered a challenge to free speech, or would that just be kind of protecting people from like another insurrection?
Yeah, I mean, very controversial decision, obviously. Legally, they're completely within their rights because, as we talked about, they're a private entity. So that they're not violating the First Amendment. They can take away anyone's right to use their service. But in terms of if they are seen as somewhat of a public square, right, where a lot of our debate happens now on Twitter. And so the argument against that is it will create an atmosphere where people can't express their views, and where the First Amendment is not something that's valued. But again, legally 100% within their rights to do that. The question is more whether they should do that as a service that some people see as kind of a public good, where we have these big discussions on.
I also have a question, and I don't know, I was unable to come on time, so I hope that this hasn't been discussed already. But if your parents, for instance, like send you to a Catholic school, but that's not what you want, are you not protected by your First Amendment right? Or is because your parents are your guardians, or could someone like bring that to a court and kind of go against that?
Yeah, a couple ways you could analyze that. One, your parents do have that control over you until you reach a certain age. The only way to prevent that is to become emancipated from them, which is a legal process, but it usually requires some evidence of abuse or neglect. Now, if you're going to that religious school and you disagree with what happens there, you obviously don't have to participate in the prayer there. So no, even at a private school, no one can compel you, for instance, to like recite a pledge. That still doesn't happen even at a private religious school. Is that what you're asking about, or are you saying just in general going to that school?
I guess just in general. I just was kind of interested in that. That makes sense to me. Yeah,
I mean, again, you'd have to. It would be rare, especially for a younger child. But I mean, I think a lot of those situations probably are worked out within the home, and maybe like a compromise could be reached. But if there wasn't, and the child had such a strongly held belief that they couldn't even attend that school, then maybe they could have a case for emancipation.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
So going back to earlier, if private entities like Twitter can take away the right to free speech, what are some of the other rights they can take away?
Oh, good question. So whatever's in their user agreement, right? So if they can't obviously defraud you of money or something like that. Like if it were a pay for service, you'd have legal remedies. But especially something that's on a speech platform, that's the primary avenue that they could use to disenfranchise you from that right. I'm trying to think, but do you have any examples or any thoughts on what else you'd be worried about? What other rights you'd be worried about them taking away? Because I can't think of any.
No, I was just curious, honestly.
Yeah, especially because it's mostly just a speech platform. I can't think of anything else that they could disenfranchise you of. Interesting question. I like that. You all are coming up with scenarios and questions that are rarely considered. This is really good. I appreciate that.
Yeah, when I think about giving up rights, I think about like people that go on like these dangerous game shows, and then they say that it's my responsibility if I like get hurt in like an obstacle course or something. Can you say more about that, Nick? I don't know much about it.
Yeah. So companies like that will indemnify themselves, meaning they'll make you waive your ability to sue them in the case of something bad happening. And most companies now have ironclad indemnification clauses, and most people don't read them. Obviously, like think about how many times we sign up for a service or a product, whether it's Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever it is, and you're definitely clicking all these boxes and agreeing to all these terms, and no one has any idea what they actually say. You'd probably have to spend a day reading Apple's terms of service, and while most of it is probably pretty benevolent stuff that'll never come into play, I'm sure there's a lot in there that is related to speech, and can remove you from their platforms for reasons that we might not think are valid, but they can because they're private entities.
So could the government like do same kind of waiver? Because I'm thinking about like the military. Like when you sign up for the military, like you're saying like, okay, if I get like, I guess I mean if you get injured in the military, they do like have services. So, but could the government like make waivers in the same sense?
No. So because the Bill of Rights explicitly says Congress shall make no law, that's saying that even the military, they can't restrict these rights that are given to you. And the way they get around that, so you're 100% right. They try to make things easier for veterans, right, by trying to give them free medical care. If a soldier does die in combat, the families are often paid a fairly substantial amount to avoid lawsuits, because you're right. You're definitely signing up for potentially losing your life, and they wouldn't want a series of lawsuits because of that. Oh wait, yeah, go ahead.
So I might have to leave early soon. Is this so like can I review the recording later if I have to leave?
Yeah, of course. Any other questions before we talk about the Facebook stuff, which we've kind of touched on already? Okay, so Facebook's Oversight Board. I hope you read that article that I sent you. If you didn't read it, though, here's a quick overview of it. They have put together this board of over 40 people. We don't know all of their names yet. They haven't actually filled out the whole thing. I think they're at like 30 or 35 people on the board. And most of them are constitutional lawyers or human rights lawyers or former judges. So a lot of legal experts on this board. Their stated goal is to ensure respect for free expression through independent judgment. What they're tasked with doing is reviewing Facebook's content decisions, So just like we're talking about with Twitter, Facebook oftentimes will take down posts, and they do this on Instagram also because Facebook owns Instagram. So for example, if someone wrote a hateful or threatening post on Instagram and it's taken down by Facebook, that person can then appeal to this board, this oversight board, to have it put back up. And the board has binding authority, means that Facebook can't do anything about it once they rule. Once they decide to put it back up or keep it down, they have final authority over it. So Facebook won't do anything about it. I'm going to put the link, I haven't put it in here yet, but I'm going to put the link into some of the cases that they've heard. I think they've only heard like 12 or 13 cases so far, not that many. And a lot of them have been overseas, actually. I think some of us in the US often forget how international Facebook is. And so a lot of these cases are arising internationally. Now, some questions for us to consider. First question is, who should be on an oversight board like this? They decided to go with all lawyers and constitutional law experts and human rights experts. Are there people that they're missing here? Who else should be on a board like this?
I guess I think really, I think obviously like it's important to have like a diverse cast of people, yet at the same time, I think that those people should like follow, you know, some like a cohesive like sense of principles. And so I guess maybe like people in international law, but those would definitely be lawyers. But at least for like what I'm thinking right now, I'm sure that others like you know, types of professions could be shown on here, but I think that, you know, maybe limiting it to just lawyers, like international judges and like human rights you know, experts and stuff like that. I think it's a good idea, just because it kind of limits like how much you know, it kind of like, yes, it promotes like diversity, but it also limits like how diverse it can get, right? And so if you have just a bunch of, you know, completely different set of principles, experiences, and expertise, then I don't know that it's going to be like as cohesive. Like you wouldn't put a doctor on the Supreme Court, or you wouldn't put, you know, at the same time, you wouldn't put a judge in the surgeon room. So I guess that's my take on it.
Yeah, no, good point there. Now, and I think that's true if we're thinking of this as a Supreme Court, but they're not technically like the Supreme Court, right? This is a very different thing they're doing. They're purely regulating speech on Facebook, and oftentimes a lot of the controversial speech on Facebook is actually relating to science. And so I think that's why the opinion piece was arguing that maybe scientists should be on there. I totally get what you're saying about not wanting a judge in surgery and then not wanting a doctor on the Supreme Court. But does anyone think that maybe there should be some scientists on this board or other professions?
I
Yeah.
think that,
Right. You can go.
okay, cool. I think there should be scientists on the board as well as like behavioral analysis. I think that there's so many other professions that deal with the human psyche and like why we do the things that we do. And they'll be able to track behaviors and understand why, or better understand the effects of certain posts. And in the article, it even says that the quote unquote Supreme Court isn't allowed to take anything down. They're just allowed to argue why things should stay up. But these people can advocate they can talk about how, or rather they can talk about why certain things should stay up or certain things should stay down in regards to like what's going to happen in the future. Of course, no one can predict the future or anything, but they can see, like, according to behavioral trends, how this will impact people in certain areas.
Yeah, I also think that it would kind of be difficult to get like subject expertise, like subject matter experts that encompass all sorts of issues that could be relevant to certain posts on the board. Like, you don't want it to be so big that it's just like hard to navigate. So like, while there may be a lot of like scientific posts, I mean, there could be posts that are like related to like sports or whatever. Does that mean you get people that are like in the world of sports? And so I don't know, I think that could get tricky as well. But like another interesting question is like, I know that you said a lot of them were like constitutional lawyers, but taking into account that Facebook and Instagram are, as we mentioned, like international platforms, it's interesting to think that like we're holding everyone to like America's standard of like what should be considered free speech. And so maybe what we should look to instead of like expanding for different subjects is like expanding to people who have contexts from different like cultures and countries around the world, because honestly what might be considered okay and like according to America's standards could be very different like in another place around the world, and not having that context I could foresee as like maybe being bad in some situations.
Yeah, and it's probably no coincidence that they're basing this on American constitutional law, because gives the most leeway to free speech. In many countries, they have stricter rules about speech. For example, Germany, right? After World War II, you basically can't even talk about Nazism, and Hitler's books are banned there. And you could argue that's for a very good reason because of what happened there. But in the US, you can still purchase a copy of Mein Kampf if you want to. And we see that as valuable. If those ideas are out there in the sunlight, then they don't get espoused in the darkness where we can't see what's going on. That's the theory behind it. Anyway.
Can I have some? I wanted to say something about the medical experts thing. I do think, especially during this time of, the pandemic and the rise and a lot of conspiracy theories, and, the spread of misinformation has just skyrocketed as well. And I think that's why I think with the medical experts, I do agree with that. But I think my issue only, not with them being on there, it's just like how much power they have, right? It's not really, the issue is not like these misinformation isn't getting taken down. They want to get it back up. It's that it's not getting taken down, right? And they don't have that power to take it down if they deem it to be misinformation. So that's my only thing, was just like, even if they do have it on board, how much power are they actually going to have? How much impact are they going to actually put on the platform if they don't have the power to take down misinformation?
Yeah, it's a great point. That's why, I mean, that was the main criticism of the article, I think, that you're hitting at, is what's really the point of this board if they can only review when Facebook takes something down? Who on Facebook is monitoring this stuff, right? A lot of people have criticized it for using like an algorithm to take these things down, and not even having humans reviewing it. So anyone want to respond to that? The idea that if Facebook isn't monitoring this better, then what's even the point of this oversight board?
Well, I think that Facebook doesn't really have a duty to monitor it, as they are a private business that just gives a platform for free speech. And I also would like to say that it is based in the US. So since the owner of Facebook is American, I mean, I don't really know how that affects that, but can't they have whatever rules or policies for their business that they want?
Yeah, as long as it's not violating US laws, then.
So they do have to apply US laws because they are based here.
Correct. Yep. So yeah, they have to apply those laws. And yeah, I think you're getting at the second question I posed here: should Facebook even be regulating speech? There are some people that think that it's not their place. That again, this is just another marketplace of ideas that shouldn't be subject to some oversight board, or shouldn't be subject to people at Facebook who we have no idea who they are, that are making these decisions.
Yeah, I would say, I don't know that Facebook should be like actively regulating speech. Like, I don't think they should be on the offensive. And at the same time, I do think that they like need to take some like defensive measures, especially like, right now, like during COVID, a lot of misinformation, where is it coming from? It's coming from Facebook, right? And so I think that, I do think this advisory board is or this kind of like, quote unquote, this kind of like mock court, I guess, is a good idea. At the same time, I don't think it should be going like on the offensive. I don't think it should be going out and looking for specific things. I guess like, sure, you can like ban some like keywords maybe, but I think it definitely needs to be like more human than just, like an algorithm going through. And so because of that, I think that it should be like more open and more transparent in that people can like submit, just like in actual courts, you can submit a case, you can, you can like report stuff, and then I think that is how it works though, right? It's you report something, and then if Facebook doesn't like do what you want it to do, you can appeal.
So yes, but there's also
Mhm.
cases where no one has reported something and it's still been removed, and that's actually two of the cases the Oversight Board looked at were in those cases, and they found it was the algorithm that had removed it, and the algorithm had messed up and thought that the person was advocating for what was said there instead of criticizing it, and so
Right.
there's some questions about that.
Mhm.
That they still haven't figured out yet, which is, look, their motto from the beginning was to move fast and break stuff, right? And they obviously have done that. We're 15, almost 20 years into their experiment, and I think this is another area where they moved very fast and didn't really think about the consequences of having this international network of people talking to each other.
However, I do think that if they're taking down things that are misinformation, like with COVID especially, I know Roman was talking about like all this misinformation about it. There was a lot of time where we didn't know what was going on with it. And if Facebook was trying to, like pick and choose what to take down, they were going to get something wrong, and then it's people not being able to understand things. Because I know Dr. Fauci and like many other people, like I follow Bill de Blasio on Twitter, and that's how I got a lot of my news recently. And I think like social media, if we're kind of guarding what we can find out, it's going to be a lot like what's been happening with TikTok, where it's like kind of controlling the information that we as the public can put out. Because I know that they're kind of like these companies that are like, making money off of the people that use the platforms, but it's also like a main mode of communication. I mean, for me at least, and for lots of my friends. So I think like when there's a board of people, I think that it's really important to guard the public from dangerous things. Maybe they're violent or sexual or things like that that are really dangerous for anybody going online. But I also think that they could do kind of like what Instagram does, of like, this has not been fact checked, or like stuff like that with keywords, instead of saying things like that. But I do think it is really difficult to like, how do you guard people from spreading hate messages without also guarding people from being aware that these hate messages exist?
Yeah, I think you're right. So they're very good at removing some content, right? Like pornographic content, they're very good at removing an explicit content. That where they have trouble, obviously, is in kind of this scientific realm. And just to play devil's advocate to your point about information about COVID, in March, in February and March, when there wasn't a lot of information, there was misinformation spread by people like Dr. Fauci and the Surgeon General Jerome Adams about mask wearing, right? That it wasn't necessary at the time. And there was the thought that we wanted to save PPE for healthcare professionals and wasn't necessary to wear a mask as in the general population. And then that obviously changed. If Facebook was at that time regulating the scientific content, they might have suppressed people who were advocating to wear masks at that time, because it was going against what Dr. Fauci and the Surgeon General were saying. And so it's a very tricky situation, and something that we kind of encountered a once in a century event with this pandemic, and obviously we weren't prepared for it on many ways. And I think social media is obviously another place where we weren't, but we have to learn from those things going forward if we're to improve this stuff.
I also wanted to bring in like a different, like look at this question a different way to hear your all's perspectives on it. So like the question, like, should Facebook be regulating speech? Obviously, if we look at it from the lens of like interpreting what the Constitution says, that they are able to technically do whatever they want, within the bounds of what is legal in U.S. law. So then, the founding fathers never would have been able to conceive of something like Facebook or Instagram and so much more technology existing today. So then maybe should we instead be evaluating the way that the Constitution, what they say about free speech in terms of these companies? Is that something that we should be taking into account as well, or look to changing in the future?
I think that's a really interesting point and something that I hadn't really thought about. But I think on that, I think that sure, right? If this Facebook oversight board ends up, interpreting the Constitution in their own way, I think the thing with that is that it's only on Facebook. And obviously, Facebook and Instagram are absolutely huge. And right now, that is probably how we get, close to 75% of all our information or all our communication, right? But at the same time, it would really only apply right on Facebook or right on Instagram. And so, if you say something on Instagram and it gets taken down for whatever reason, you can go and say that on Snapchat, or you can go in real life and say it, right? And so the interpretation is only specific to the platform that it's on. But I think it does present a weird kind of challenge of okay, who gave you the authority, or why do you have the right to interpret the Constitution in your own way, right?
Yes, and to Madison's point, and I'll stay quiet after this because I want to hear what more of you think. There are definitely commentators and politicians who do want to rethink the First Amendment and who it applies to. And I'm not suggesting if this is good or bad, but these commentators, might want to regulate big tech companies even more stringently about this stuff, and even force them to regulate this speech more, which will require some changes potentially to the First Amendment. If anyone have thoughts on that? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that changing or adding amendments or trying to change parts of the Constitution at this time would actually be pretty disastrous, or just doesn't sound like a good idea considering what we have already, as that was the building blocks. And we could add more laws maybe, but I don't think that would be necessary. Especially an amendment would probably be a bad idea, or trying to change something.
It is quite hard to amend the Constitution, as we know. Also, hasn't been done in quite a while, and the last time it was done was fairly non-controversial, just making sure that Congress couldn't raise their own salaries.
I wanted to add something, not necessarily to the Constitution, although it is a very interesting perspective and could delve deeper. But I want to comment on something about the spread of it, right? And I think the issue with platforms like Facebook, platforms like Instagram, is that the way, especially Facebook and YouTube even, they spread rapidly, right? They have over billions of users, and the algorithms predict exactly what these users want. So if they really encounter conspiracy theories, they're just going to feed them more conspiracy theories. And I think I don't think we should really let them off the hook so much, because the way their platforms are built, is designed is to, I think the article pointed out, is to profit off of that, right? Is to be able to ensure that they're getting that, their money sense, and they're getting from that behavior. And so I think that's why it really isn't in their best interest to do it, to regulate, because they're getting money from it. They're getting money from people clicking these things, and they're getting money from interactions. And I think just that from the business model perspective, they would rather not regulate it, because it's going to affect their bottom line, as the article said. But it does cause really negative effects, because Now the impact is our health. Now the impact is people not getting vaccinated, people not becoming sick, people dying, you know, like, or not knowing where to get. And so I think now, like, you know, or like anti-vaxxers, for example, that's another, and it's, you know, people who were just completely against vaccines, which puts the risk to public health. And I think that's why they should have a level of responsibility for that, because lives are being affected, lives are being lost. And because the spread is so powerful, I think that's why I do think they should be regulating speech, but I do concede to the fact that, yeah, we didn't elect these people. Who are they to say what should be on here, what should not? And really, I don't know how to answer that question either. So,
well, I think that you're right that we didn't elect these people, but we're using their platform. So, you know, we consented to this. We checked that box of terms of use, basically. So we agreed to that. And I also think that it's a person's duty to monitor what content they consume and to fact check what they read, see, whatever, you know, they consume. It's not, you know, platform's job necessarily to, it's not their job to hide stuff from us that might be false, because it's our decision to believe it or not.
I respectfully disagree, because I think it is.
Oh, there you go. We lost your mic for a second.
Oh, okay. So what I'm saying is, like, you know, even though we are using the platform and it's like what we agreed to, you know, it doesn't mean that we don't have the right to like ask for something better and say that this is what we don't like about it and this is what needs to change. And I think that they do have a responsibility as a platform to make it so, you know, kids aren't going on there and seeing people get their heads chopped off. I think that it's completely reasonable for us as the consumers of media to, you know, go on a site like that and expect that because it's so popular that it kind of has a hold on what's being allowed there. I think that, you know, yes, it's up to us to fact check and consume, but I mean, during Corona, it was so terrifying and nerve-wracking to not know what was going on. And there were lots of news sites saying different things, and Facebook was an area to get news. And I think that when we were unable to fact check, I think Facebook has so many people saying different things and kind of like replying to each other that it was a great way to learn what was going on and what people were feeling. And I think that even just going on Facebook is like choosing what platform is choosing what media you consume. And I think it's hard to go past there without asking for a change within that platform.
Yeah, definitely. And I wanted to
ask. Okay, I'll just finish this quickly, but you can definitely ask, but I just don't think it's your right on them, you know? Oh, you can go ahead, Roman.
Right. Okay. I was gonna say, I think usually my approach to free speech is just kind of like, okay, instead of like suppressing it, you open more speech, right? So that there's more plurality and that people's, you know, opinions are checking each other. The problem is, though, in real life that happens, right? So the problem with social media is that it's designed to build echo chambers, right? And so if you fall down a rabbit hole, you're really not going to get out of there. Or you have it's going to be very hard to get out of there. And so really what it does is, if you allow these rabbit holes to kind of exist, what can really happen is that, you know, people aren't getting their facts checked, right? They aren't getting their opinions checked. They're not hearing other people because there's so like little regulation, and we kind of allow like these rabbit holes to exist. Now, granted, you know, a rabbit hole, the point is that it looks, you know, unassuming at the top, but you go further and further. And so it definitely is a tricky thing to kind of regulate. But really my point is that I think that there is a design issue with a lot of social media, and we have to consider that when we're talking about free speech. in that it doesn't allow for plurality, but instead it like is designed to build echo chambers.
Yeah, no, thank you for that point, Roman. That was another question that I put on here, which we're not going to have time to answer. We have to wrap up soon. But even Facebook's own data, and Zuckerberg has talked about this, shows that false and hateful content often drives the most clicks. And then once people kind of, like Roman says, go down those rabbit holes, the algorithm keeps feeding them more and more of that content. And whereas, 20, 30 years ago, in order to get that content, it would be a lot harder. It's now obviously a lot easier. The traditional concept of speech was that if you didn't like someone else's speech and you didn't like what was being said, then come up with better speech, come up with a better argument for it. And that worked for a long time. But if we never get to confront each other with that speech, if we're in these echo chambers and those opinions go unchallenged, then it becomes harder and harder. The last case I'll mention to you involved a group of neo-Nazis in the 1970s in a town called Skokie, Illinois, who wanted to hold a protest in this town and wanted to have a pro-Nazi rally in the United States in the 1970s. And a lot of people were trying to prevent them from doing that. Well, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, actually defended their right to hold that rally. And the reason they did that was to protect the First Amendment for everyone. And what ended up happening was there was a larger counter protest on the other side that far outnumbered the number of neo-Nazis that showed up to their protest. And essentially, the speech was out there. It was out in the open. You could see who these people were, and the embarrassment that they received and the counter protest was enough to quell it, right, without suppressing it and without violating the First Amendment. So I'll leave you with that. The question is, how do we do that in the 21st century on these platforms? How does we train and teach young people to recognize what's good speech and what's bad speech, what's valid information, what is disinformation? And we're not going to be able to solve it tonight. But I really thank you all for joining. This was fascinating to hear all your thoughts. And we'll do another one of these in another couple of weeks on a different topic. And if you have ideas for other topics that you want covered, feel free to message me and we can talk about it. So thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What were your thoughts?
It was fun.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, I didn't know how it was going to go. I wish there was a way while I'm sharing my screen to be able to see more people. That's the only thing. I can only see like 4 of them at a time. It's kind of hard to get a feel of everybody.
Mm.
What did you think?
Yeah, you can stop recording, by the way.
Yeah, good idea.